The heat of the New Guinea jungle was not merely weather. It was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket woven from humidity and the metallic scent of spilled blood. By mid-1942, the Japanese were not simply holding ground, they were fusing with it. Their strongholds, carved deep into the steaming mountains and tangled mangrove swamps, were proving impervious to every conventional doctrine the Allies threw at them. In a hidden sector of the Owen Stanley Range, a company of elite Australian infantry, the jungle's supposed masters, met their breaking point. They had been tasked with taking a ridge no larger than a football field, a position referred to grimly as the Terminus. Days dissolved into weeks of relentless, unseen warfare. The Japanese didn't engage in massed attacks. They operated in silence. Their ambushes launched from terrain that Allied manuals deemed impassable. Supplies vanished. Sentries were found with throats slit, often just yards from their posts, leaving behind no boot print, no broken twig, only a chilling, invisible perimeter. The final report from the sector was blunt. Objective maintained by the enemy. Our casualty rate is unsustainable. Enemy mastery of the environment is absolute. The failure of conventional doctrine led to the makeshift Allied war room in Brisbane, a cavern of flickering lamps and stale smoke, where desperation had replaced strategy. Generals shuffled thick dossiers filled with reports of disease, psychological fatigue, and a growing superstitious fear among the troops. It was here, at the lowest point, that Dr. Alistair Vance was given the floor. Vance was an outsider, an anthropologist recruited by the OSS, who looked less like a soldier and more like a man who spent too much time studying ancient texts. Vance did not speak of artillery or flanking maneuvers. He spoke of knowledge. "We are fighting a 20th century war with 19th century minds," he argued, his voice cutting through the tension. "The Japanese are masters of this specific terrain, but they are still foreign to it. There exist people who have perfected the art of jungle combat, not for decades, but for millennia." He pointed to a map of South America. "If we are to beat the jungle, we must first recruit the very spirits who rule it." Vance's radical proposal to recruit indigenous Amazonian scouts from deep within Brazil was met with a mixture of scoffing and moral panic. "Weaponizing savages," one general muttered. But the casualty figures provided all the justification necessary. Strategic necessity won the debate. Vance was immediately dispatched, partnering with Major Costa, a slick, cynical officer from Brazilian military intelligence. Costa saw the Amazonian tribes not as potential allies, but as backward citizens to be controlled. "The Indios are good for collecting rubber, Doctor," Costa sneered during the flight south, "not for winning a modern war." This early friction highlighted the colonial exploitation inherent in the mission. The Allies wanted their knowledge, but not their respect. Their journey concluded deep in the Mato Grosso, at a secluded Catholic mission run by Father Elias. The missionary, haggard and worn by years in isolation, became Vance's reluctant intermediary. Elias had earned the trust of the Kayapo and Munduruku, but he saw the military mission for what it was, a catastrophic intrusion. "The knowledge they possess is not for your war, Doctor," Father Elias warned Vance, his eyes full of sorrow. "It is sacred. It is tied to the survival of their soul, not the destruction of others. You take their warrior path and strip it of context. It will destroy the men who use it." Vance, driven by the perceived righteousness of defeating the Axis, pushed past the warning. He sat with the elders, men whose wisdom was etched onto their faces like maps. He promised them protection for their ancestral lands and immunity from the Brazilian state. The elders, sensing the encroaching tide of global conflict and the inevitable destruction of their forests by Obranco, the white man, reluctantly agreed. They offered up their fittest, their most skilled trackers, warriors who saw the rainforest not as a barrier, but as an open book. The final agreement was a fragile, Faustian bargain. In exchange for preserving their land, they would turn their ancient expertise into the most lethal classified weapon of World War II. As the initial cadre of scouts was selected, men whose very existence was rooted in the primordial world, they were given U.S. dog tags, marking their doomed hybrid fate. The program, classified and renamed the Jungle Phantoms, was born out of desperation, ambition, and a profound, willful ignorance of the spiritual price of total war. The secret training facility was not a barracks or a compound. It was a scar carved briefly into the edge of the jungle's unending green, a day's hike from any navigable river, intentionally undocumented and unmapped. Here, the two worlds collided. The meticulous, quantitative brutality of Western military training met the fluid, qualitative deadliness of the Amazonian ancestral path. The training was led by Dr. Vance, now acting as the lead handler, assisted by a handful of specialized U.S. Army Rangers who were hand-picked for their discipline, but were soon humbled into silence. Vance had intended to augment the scouts' skills, but quickly realized he could only observe and direct them. The true instructors were the scouts themselves. They taught the Rangers to differentiate hundreds of shades of green, each signaling a different threat or resource, and to track by scent, residual heat, and the almost imperceptible changes in the damp, rotting leaf litter. The Rangers, initially arrogant, were shocked by the scouts' physical and mental integration with the forest. A scout could traverse 100 yards of dense jungle in absolute silence, while a ranger sounded like a locomotive. They navigated without compasses, reading the water table, the root systems, and the direction of the sun through the leaf canopy. The training focused not on shooting, but on stealth, anticipation, and demoralization. The disturbing core of the training, however, lay in the weaponization of the scouts' ancestral psychological warfare. Vance, reading the field reports from New Guinea, began to encourage techniques that involved using the jungle itself as a medium for terror. This meant more than just tracking. It meant the deliberate practice of ritual trophy-taking, leaving behind signs of violence tailored not to kill, but to shatter the enemy's will. They practiced methods of utilizing specialized plant toxins derived from hunting rituals, poisons that induced rapid paralysis, terrifying hallucinations, or immediate silent cardiac arrest. Techniques far more efficient and untraceable than any chemical agent the Allies possessed. This moral translation, the twisting of sacred ritual into instruments of mass military terror, was the breaking point for the embedded U.S. medical officer, whose observer's journal became the program's first internal indictment. His entry read, "These men are not soldiers. They are being trained to be specters. We are destroying the cultural anchor that holds their warrior path sacred, replacing it only with the military objective. They are losing the why of their knowledge, leaving only the devastating how." A specific incident highlighted this contradiction. A young Munduruku scout, whose training included the use of a traditional bark fiber garrote, attempted a purification ritual after a successful exercise, a necessary step in his tribe's framework for leaving the warpath. A military handler, unaware and impatient, interrupted him, ordering him to clean his rifle instead. The handler's dismissal of the ritual as primitive nonsense caused a visible, immediate distress in the scout. It was a searing illustration of the cultural context being stripped away, leaving the warrior trapped in a limbo where his sacred duty was reduced to a tool of another man's war. Despite the mounting ethical concerns, the results of the training were undeniable. The scouts, now officially designated the Jungle Phantoms, were physically and mentally prepared for a level of combat the Allies had never conceived. Their effectiveness was a force multiplier that promised to save thousands of American lives. The unit, dressed in minimalist gear, their bodies painted with traditional markings that now seemed less spiritual protection and more chilling warning, being ushered onto a cargo plane. They carried modern rifles, but their true weapons, the terror, the silence, and the knowledge of the jungle's deepest secrets, were invisible. They were heading to the Pacific, an indigenous force about to fight the world's most mechanized war. The price for this power, the destruction of the warrior's soul, and the erasure of his people's cultural integrity, was just about to be paid. The atmosphere aboard the transport plane was tense, not from external threat, but from the contained power of the Jungle Phantoms. They landed at a dusty, remote airstrip in Papua New Guinea, where the air was thick with the smell of volcanic ash and decaying vegetation. Their mission: neutralize the Japanese hold on a series of strategic ridges blocking a crucial Allied advance, positions that had cost a full regiment of Australian soldiers. The Phantoms vanished into the terrain, leaving their handler, Dr. Vance, behind with a rudimentary radio that remained stubbornly silent. The operation began not with a bang, but with a terrifying stillness. Days crawled by. Vance had nothing to report, save for the oppressive silence. Transitioning to the enemy perspective, WWII, Shiro's diary entries from his deep, fortified bunker on one of the ridges documented the gradual onset of terror. Initially, he dismissed the missing sentries as desertion, or perhaps the work of Allied snipers. "The jungle fever," he wrote, "makes the men weak. They imagine shadows." But the reports became too frequent, too bizarre. A patrol of 5 men vanished from a heavily mined perimeter. An investigation found their rifles stacked neatly, their uniforms folded, but the men were gone, leaving only small, cryptic markings etched into the bark of a nearby tree. Lieutenant Shiro's diary entries grew frantic. Tonight, the cook found the body of Private Kenji. He was untouched, no bullet wound, no knife wound. He died with his hands covering his eyes, in a posture of utmost terror. On the ground beside him, a single object, a small, dried trophy. This is not war. We are fighting spirits, forest demons. The scouts did not fight the Japanese line. They dismantled the Japanese mind. Using their profound knowledge of plant toxins to contaminate water sources, they induced confusion and paranoia. They utilized subtle acoustic deception, mimicking the sounds of their victims' own indigenous spiritual beliefs, to convince them they were being hunted by something supernatural, something beyond the protection of the Emperor. The climax of the operation came when Allied command, bracing for another bloody offensive, prepared to storm the fortress on Hill 609. The Marines advanced, fully expecting machine gun fire, but found the position eerily silent. They entered to find not a battle, but a scene of total psychological collapse. Japanese soldiers lay in catatonic states, driven insane by days of unseen terror. Others had taken their own lives. Some simply sat, staring blankly, their weapons abandoned. A fictional Marine captain's log, later obtained through a partial FOIA release decades later, chronicled the shock. Date: October 17th, 1943. Objective 609 secured. 0 Allied casualties. The enemy was neutralized, but not by combat. Wounds and psychological conditions inconsistent with known warfare. The unit that did this left no trace. They are not human soldiers. They are a force of nature. Request immediate high-level investigation into the methods employed. This was not a victory. It was a cleansing. When Vance finally received the full report, objective achieved, 0 friendly losses, he felt a perverse sense of triumph mixed with profound horror. The program was a spectacular, unimaginable success, but the tactical genius was inseparable from the visceral, untraceable brutality. He had promised the elders their knowledge would be used for good, but the results were a testament to pure, distilled terror. The mission report immediately triggered a response from the highest levels of Pacific Command. A coded 2-line memo, later found heavily redacted, confirmed the internal dilemma. Effectiveness, undeniable. Methods require strictest operational security. The risk to the Allied moral narrative is too high. The decision was made. The program would continue, but the unit's existence, identity, and methods would be instantly and systematically suppressed. The Ghost unit had won the battle, but in doing so, had signed its own death warrant and sealed its entire history away. The horrifying effectiveness demonstrated at Hill 609 did not lead to the program's termination. It led inevitably to its expansion. The military brass, concerned less with moral integrity and more with strategic victory and reduced U.S. casualty counts, sent down the draconian order. The jungle phantoms would be deployed across every major jungle theater in the Pacific, but their methods were to be documented only in terms of quantifiable success, with all details of execution immediately classified Black Shield. Dr. Vance, now acting as a strategic coordinator rather than a handler, felt his conscience fraying. He was selling the very soul of the Amazon for short-term tactical gain. The expansion saw new deployments across the Philippines, the Solomon Islands, and Borneo. In Leyte, a massive Japanese supply depot was abandoned after 3 weeks of the Phantom's presence, with the enemy commander citing only a pervasive sense of dread. The success was undeniable, but the cracks were deepening. The military's attempt to sanitize the operations created a profound rift among the Allied observers. Introduce Lut Miller, a young U.S. handler assigned to a Phantom unit operating near Samar. Miller was ordered to verify the objective was cleared, but explicitly warned against asking how. His reports, however, became increasingly erratic. He described finding small, meticulously arranged trophy displays at the perimeter of abandoned enemy bunkers, objects that were utterly alien to the Marines' combat experience, but terrifyingly familiar to the indigenous context the scouts brought. Miller's logbook entry captured the growing crisis. The silence is the worst part. We come in, the fighting is over, but it feels like the most brutal part just finished. When I questioned one of the scouts about the markings, he just stared past me. He wasn't malicious, just absent. I tried teaching him a simple phrase for prayer, something to anchor him, but he can only chant the names of his enemies. The tactical methodologies began to evolve, becoming increasingly sophisticated and cruel. The scouts, understanding the power of suggestion, began integrating military psychological warfare concepts into their ancient practices. They used crude, field-adapted sound equipment to amplify the jungle's natural unsettling sounds, and mix them with specific, culturally resonant warnings, an auditory deception designed to create full-blown auditory hallucinations and paralysis among the already terrified Japanese soldiers. Furthermore, the application of plant neurotoxins was refined, ensuring that the victims survived long enough to transmit the terror to their comrades before succumbing to a hallucinated, agonizing death. This acceleration of success came paired with mounting evidence of the warriors' psychological disintegration. The observer's journal reappeared, smuggled out by a junior clerk before the medical officer was forcibly reassigned. The final entry before the transfer was damning. The scouts are showing severe dissociation, They no longer distinguish between the operational environment and their ancestral home. They operate in a state of permanent warpath consciousness. They are becoming permanent weapons, incapable of return. The program is not just winning the war, it is destroying the very soul of our allies. Despite this chilling warning, the command structure was blinded by success. A confidential memo from a senior Pacific staff officer dismissed the psychological reports as unnecessary moral hand-wringing, concluding, "If a handful of men can clear a 1,000-man garrison without costing us a single casualty, the method, however unpleasant, is a strategic imperative." The strategic victories continued throughout late 1944 and early 1945, but the price, paid exclusively by the Amazonian warriors, reached its inevitable catastrophic peak. The scouts, far from their spiritual anchors and operating in a state of hyper-vigilant psychological terror for years, suffered a complete breakdown. The warpath consciousness, once a temporary, ritualized state, became their permanent, devastating reality. They could no longer recognize the boundaries between the mission and the self, between the enemy and the non-enemy. The breaking point arrived in January 1945 at an undisclosed Allied staging area near the Philippines. A unit of jungle phantoms, returning from a deep reconnaissance mission, approached the American perimeter. They were clean of obvious wounds, yet utterly transformed. When challenged with the current password, they did not respond with the required cadence. Instead, they began a low, rhythmic chant, a traditional Amazonian battle song meant to confuse and paralyze the enemy. The ensuing incident was brief, brutal, and utterly devastating to the program's deniability. The scouts, convinced the Americans were another territorial threat, lashed out with the ruthlessness they had perfected against the Japanese. A fictional military police report, later partially declassified in a corruption inquiry, detailed the chaotic, confusing scene. 14 casualties, mostly severe psychological trauma and untraceable lacerations. The attack was not conventional combat. It was a focused, ritualistic cleansing of the perimeter. The unit was eventually subdued, but only after heavy chemical sedation. They did not appear to register pain or recognition. The event confirmed the dire warnings of the Observer's Journal. A military psychiatrist brought in from the States quickly produced a final, unequivocal evaluation. Complete and irreversible identity dissolution. These individuals are non-reintegrable into any known social structure, military or civilian. They exist solely in the context of the mission. They are classified as uncontrollable security risks. The command meeting that followed was swift, cold, and utterly devoid of moral consideration. The High Command recognized they had created a weapon too potent and too self-destructive to handle. The general's order, delivered in coded bursts, was merciless. The program could not be terminated by conventional means, as that would necessitate an official record of its existence. Instead, the warriors themselves would be erased. Their fate was sealed. They would receive no service records, no medals, no benefits. They were to be quietly reclassified as enemy combatants captured in the field, a cynical lie, and transferred out of U.S. jurisdiction. Major Costa oversaw the final clandestine transfer. The surviving scouts, heavily sedated and reduced to silent inert cargo, were flown far south to a new, purpose-built facility near Manaus, Brazil. Dr. Vance, the architect of the bargain, was forced to write the official notification to Father Elias and the tribal elders. The words tasted like ash. The warriors died bravely in the service of their people's future. The lie was complete, sealing the warriors' heroism, their trauma, and the nation's guilt in a vault of deliberate falsehood. The warriors, who had fought to preserve their culture from a global war, were now permanently imprisoned by the very people who had promised to protect them. The war ended for the Allies in 1945, but for the Amazon Jungle Scouts, the true conflict, the fight against oblivion, was just beginning. The institutional betrayal launched in Chapter 5 manifested as a relentless, bureaucratic campaign to eliminate every trace of the unit's existence. This was the era of the vanishing. Military clerks in the Pentagon and in Brasilia were tasked with manually purging the archives. Service records were destroyed or reclassified under code names for defunct ordnance programs. All operational memos referencing jungle phantoms or indigenous assets were sealed and filed under the highest classification, designated to remain so for 80 years. The American effort was meticulously coordinated with the Brazilian government, who ensured that all local documentation, logistics, contracts, and even air traffic reports concerning the secret facility were destroyed. The fate of the surviving warriors was sealed inside the remote, heavily guarded Manaus facility. Here, Major Costa oversaw their containment, a duty he performed with cold detachment. A fictional staff nurse's confession, later revealed in a deathbed testimony, painted a chilling picture. We were told they were dangerous enemy combatants, but they were mostly silent. They were kept under heavy chemical sedation. They didn't speak. They didn't interact. Their eyes just held the jungle. Most didn't survive 5 years. They died of apathy, I think, and the inability to return to their spiritual home. They were simply waiting to be forgotten. Meanwhile, back in the Amazonian territories, the silence was interpreted as death. Father Elias and the remaining tribal elders attempted to inquire about the warriors' promised return. They were met with cold indifference by Brazilian authorities and official denial by U.S. liaisons. The promise of protecting their ancestral lands, the very foundation of the Faustian bargain, was immediately and brutally broken. The Brazilian government, emboldened by post-war economic shifts, initiated massive development and relocation programs, citing the need for national security and resource exploitation. The indigenous communities were forcibly separated from their homelands, often under the escort of Brazilian military police. The strategic purpose was dual: to exploit the land and to silence the only population who knew the truth about the missing warriors. Elders who persisted in speaking of the warriors who never came back were dismissed as myth-tellers, their historical knowledge systematically undermined by official propaganda that only celebrated sanitized, distant versions of indigenous bravery. The financial evidence of the cover-up persisted in only one fragment: a leaked 1947 U.S. defense budget document, which contained a large recurring payment for a line item cryptically labeled Indigenous Asset Containment and Maintenance. This entry confirmed that the U.S. was still financing the silent imprisonment and eventual demise of its former allies years after the war ended. The chapter ends with the disillusioned Dr. Vance, now retired and seeking obscurity. Unable to reconcile the program's strategic success with its human catastrophe, he takes his final act of self-justification, burning his primary field journals. He kept only the earliest pages, which detailed the warriors' initial heroism before the methods turned dark. A pathetic attempt to preserve a narrative of noble intent. The rest of the truth was reduced to ash, symbolically sealing the warriors' suffering beneath a blanket of bureaucratic lies and historical oblivion. The suppression of the Amazon Jungle Scouts was ruthlessly efficient, but the knowledge they wielded was too valuable to the military-industrial complex to remain buried. As the Cold War intensified, the lessons learned from the jungle phantoms, stripped of their messy cultural context and moral cost, were methodically resurrected and sanitized, becoming the foundational doctrine for a new era of unconventional warfare. The 1950s saw the circulation of classified CIA and Special Forces training manuals that referenced the necessity of psychological terrain dominance. These techniques, while never explicitly linking back to the Amazon, bore an undeniable structural resemblance to the Scouts' methods. Extreme emphasis on stealth and camouflage, the use of sonic manipulation and psychological conditioning designed to break enemy morale before physical contact. The tactical innovations were celebrated as breakthroughs, divorced entirely from the mass graves of their true inventors. This sanitized doctrine was exported globally. In the early 1960s, these methodologies surfaced in U.S. training manuals for the nascent conflicts in Southeast Asia. Operation Phoenix in Vietnam, designed to dismantle Viet Cong infrastructure, utilized terror and localized psychological operations that echoed the Jungle Phantoms playbook, using fear, invisibility, and the strategic removal of key figures to create a climate of pervasive insecurity. The methods were cleaner, utilizing modern technology, but the core principle, winning by demoralizing the enemy into surrender, was pure Amazonian doctrine. The program's structural exploitation also found new life in Latin America. Major Costa, the former handler, resurfaced in the 1960s, working as a jungle warfare consultant for several military dictatorships. He personally trained forces in Bolivia and Paraguay in Indian pacification programs, effectively teaching repressive regimes how to use versions of the Amazon Scouts' tactics against their own indigenous populations. The knowledge, once stolen to fight a world war, was now being used to enforce tyranny, completing its final, cynical corruption. Despite the comprehensive cover-up, the truth occasionally flickered. In 1973, a former OSS officer published a memoir detailing his disillusionment with the intelligence community. Before publication, several pages referencing the Amazon Project were hastily removed by agency lawyers. A censored version of the book circulated privately, fueling the first whispers of a hidden WWII unit that had vanished without trace. A more substantial crack appeared in 1989, when Brazil briefly established a Truth Commission. A retired nurse who had worked at the Manaus facility in the late 1940s attempted to give testimony about the silent Indian patients. She spoke of their sedation, their withdrawal, and the secretive American involvement. Her testimony was quickly dismissed as senile rambling and suppressed within a week, but the audio recording was secretly archived by a diligent clerk, a fragile piece of evidence waiting decades for discovery. The warriors were erased for being too effective and morally compromising, yet their forbidden knowledge became the invisible foundation of the United States' Cold War victory in unconventional theater. The ghosts of the Amazon were not only imprisoned, but their very legacy was stolen and weaponized against future generations, ensuring the injustice would perpetually haunt the global military-industrial complex. The narrative of the Amazon Jungle Scouts remained dormant, not because the truth was fully suppressed, but because the evidence was scattered, highly classified, and located in two different national archives. For decades, the story existed only as fragmented whispers within the special operations community and the marginalized indigenous territories. The crucial shift began in the 1990s as Cold War files began to yield small, inconsistent leaks. An investigative historian and journalist named Dr. Renata Silva, a specialist in historical exploitation of the Amazon, became the central figure in uncovering the remaining fragments. While researching state violence against the Kayapo, she stumbled upon the redacted 1947 budget line item referencing indigenous asset containment. This single, cold, bureaucratic phrase acted as her compass. Renata's investigation was a slow-motion study in institutional obstruction. Archives were sealed. Officials offered no comment, and her academic funding was mysteriously withdrawn after a paper referencing the WWII-era Brazilian military's unusual interest in the jungle interior. She realized the story wasn't just old history, it was active security. She eventually secured a clandestine meeting with the elderly Major Costa, the former handler, now living in isolated, guilt-ridden retirement. Costa, fearing prosecution, but desperate to unburden his soul, refused to speak directly about the program. Instead, he provided cryptic confirmation, referencing the military concept. They taught us how to win a fight using nothing. No logistics, no radio, just fear and the forest. That lesson was too valuable to admit and too effective to forget. The project was successful, which is why it was buried. The breakthrough came via digital archaeology. Renata obtained a low-resolution satellite map from a former Brazilian intelligence employee. The map highlighted a long-disused military complex near Manaus and, critically, a nearby unmarked burial ground. This location finally gave a physical place to the haunting words of the 1947 budget line. Renata's research led her back to the source, the indigenous communities. She managed to interview an elderly Munduruku tribal member, whose father had been recruited for the unit. The elder spoke not of war strategy, but of a deep, cultural wound. She recounted a specific spiritual chant the warriors took with them, a complex sequence meant to facilitate the ritual return from the warpath to the community. They never completed the chant, the elder whispered, her voice cracking. They were not allowed to return. They are still lost between the spirit world and your war. The fragmented evidence coalesced into undeniable fact when the 2015 mass grave discovery near the abandoned Manaus facility made international headlines. Forensic teams confirmed human remains dating to the late 1940s and 1950s, igniting a public relations crisis for both Brazil and the US. This discovery, born from the initial act of betrayal 70 years prior, finally forced a limited, official investigation into the historical anomaly. The chapter closes as Renata receives an anonymous package. Inside is a small, brittle photograph of Dr. Alistair Vance, alongside several pages from his burned observer's journal, saved fragments detailing the spiritual warnings and the program's inevitable psychological dissolution. The suppressed truth, once a myth, was now a verifiable, documented tragedy. The ghosts of the Amazon were finally ready to tell their story. The discovery of the unmarked graves in 2015 served as the devastating, final punctuation mark to the decades of official denial. Dr. Renata Silva, armed with the fragments of the Observer's Journal, the damning 1947 budget line, and the archived testimony from the Truth Commission, finally had the full, catastrophic narrative. The historical investigation moved from the shadows of conspiracy to the cold light of accountability. The final accounting was delivered not by official decree, but by investigative reports. It was confirmed that an estimated 300 to 400 indigenous scouts were recruited. Fewer than 30 were confirmed alive by 1960, and none had received military honors, pensions, or any acknowledgement of service. Their remains lay in unmarked plots, a testament to institutional violence. The thematic focus shifted definitively to the legacy of betrayal. The story was no longer just about a secret unit. It was about the deliberate destruction of cultural identity for tactical gain. The spiritual chant of returning, mentioned by the elderly Munduruku woman, became the symbol of the immense spiritual cost. The warriors were not merely killed or imprisoned. They were denied the essential right of closure, a refusal that trapped their souls between the battlefield and their homeland. Renata's work revealed that the program's horrific success was due to the weaponization of sacred knowledge. This knowledge required a cultural and spiritual framework for reintegration, which the military deliberately omitted, viewing the warriors as expendable tools. The military achieved a strategic victory in the Pacific, but at the cost of committing a profound moral defeat by betraying the dignity and life of their most effective allies. To the present day, the accountability void remains. Despite overwhelming evidence, neither the US nor the Brazilian government has formally acknowledged the program, issued an apology, or provided comprehensive reparations to the surviving communities. The names of most of the scouts remain missing, hidden behind layers of classification that still prioritize institutional self-preservation over human justice. The final scene returns to the present-day Amazon. Dr. Renata Silva, exhausted but resolved, stands alone near the site of the former Manaus facility, now a stark, abandoned clearing by the discovered burial ground. She is not performing a military tribute, but a simple, reverent act of remembrance. She speaks the names of the few warriors she was able to identify, and for the rest, she speaks the names of their tribes, offering a handful of tobacco and a simple prayer in Portuguese, Spanish, and the ancestral language of the Yanomami. It is a solitary act of atonement, providing the closure the warriors were denied. The Amazon jungle scouts have no monument. Their families were lied to, and their history was incinerated. The only redemption left is remembrance. The only justice remaining is truth. They were not savages. They were warriors with expertise that took centuries to develop, recruited into a war they didn't start, and erased when they became inconvenient. The price of our victory was the wholesale spiritual destruction of our indigenous allies. This is not a call to darkness. This is a demand for light, the light of truth, accountability, and the sacred responsibility to remember those our governments chose to forget. Refuse to let them be buried again.